So I'm going to be talking about a collaborative project between researchers at the Institute for Work and Health, shown here in blue, led by Emil Tompa, who's with us in the orange shirt. And it was a collaboration between us and operations management researchers, primarily at York University. They were led by Mark Pagel, who is now moved on to Dublin, Ireland. He's the driving force behind this project. Really, it's a pair of projects, and I'm going to tell you first about our exploratory multiple case study, which was then followed by a survey-based hypothesis testing second study. But first, I'm going to lay the groundwork for the bigger picture that's really driving this research and a larger body of research that Mark has been pursuing for many years now. So you'll recognize on the right-hand side of the slide is the sphere of interest to me and other workplace researchers that focus on health and safety management. So we're generally interested in identifying best practices in health and safety and how they relate to health and safety outcomes, which we often measure with WSIB claim rates, self-report data. But it turns out there's kind of a parallel world over here in operations management. And they are similarly looking for best practices in operations, looking at relationships with their outcomes of interest. And it's seldom that the two worlds meet, even though the production system is the same and the workforce is the same. So you would expect there should be some interrelationships. And so this is what this collaboration allowed us to do, is to look at relationships among constructs that often aren't studied together. And the overarching interest is to understand whether when you're seeking success in operations, do you necessarily need to sacrifice safety? Is there a trade-off between the achievement of these goals? Or is there actually complementarity or even synergy? So the argument for complementarity and synergy, some of the strands go like this. If you look at what has been identified as best practices in each field, you'll find some overlap in terms of employee involvement, preventive maintenance. And we know that the larger, more sophisticated firms have moved towards integrated management systems, integrating health and safety into pre-existing management systems for quality like 9001. And there are reviews of the literature like that led by Emil Tompa and adjunct scientist Patrick Newman at Ryerson University. And when they've reviewed the literature on safety interventions, ergonomic interventions, they find that generally there's an organizational benefit. The limitation with a lot of the research reviewed here, however, is it's often not on the plant level with multiple workplaces. Now, on the other side, the trade-off argument, there's the argument that managerial attention is finite. And similarly, there may be role overload for a worker trying to meet both safety demands and operational demands. And that's really the premise of safety climate research, which is concerned with what cues a worker receives about what's a priority. And implicitly and even explicitly, those demands are thought to be in conflict. And finally, there's a body of research that has focused on lean production, which is considered best practice in the operations field. And it's been associated with adverse health and safety outcomes, particularly musculoskeletal disorders and stress-related conditions. And this has been found in the auto sector in North America in particular. Yes? Julie. That is a good question. And fortunately, I have a slide about that. So here's a definition from a textbook. An integrated set of activities designed to achieve high volume production using minimal inventories of raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. A manufacturing context with this definition. And so lean production really started with the Toyota production system being introduced into North America. And it's since moved into hospitals and recently construction. But if we go to researchers in this area, they will actually identify 4 bundles of management practices that you might not interpret from looking at that. These bundles have shown to be a component of lean production. And there's the issue of when people say that they're implementing lean, what do they mean? Do they just mean just-in-time production, or is it something more comprehensive? So the first bundle, just-in-time production, is about, customer orders something and the supply chain is set up to just produce it as required, so there's no buildup of inventory or produced product. Total preventive maintenance is concerned with optimizing the use of your machinery, so you have a schedule, you maintain it so that there's no unexpected breakdowns and bottlenecks and maybe late delivery. Total quality management, it's about preventing defects in the products or service and looking upstream for variances that might cause such defects and preventing them and correcting them. And then finally, the human resource management component is concerned with building involved, skilled workers. So there's practices like training, semi-autonomous teams. And so this really constitutes lean production. Does that provide a comprehensive answer to your question? Yeah, okay. So turning to our research. The first study consisted or involved 10 workplaces, 8 in manufacturing, 2 were distribution centers. They were varied in size, and we had both unionized and non-unionized workplaces. We collected data in a few ways. First, by conducting interviews with managers about their operational practices and their safety practices. We also interviewed the union rep in unionized workplaces. Now, operational outcomes was measured in this interesting way, validated self-report scale where multi-item scales where the respondent rates their organization relative to others in their sector. Safety, we also measured quantitatively using WSIB claims data and a safety climate snapshot using 30 workers in a convenience sample. So using these quantitative outcomes, it was possible to sort these 10 workplaces. And as you see, they rather neatly sorted into 2 clusters. There was a high-performance cluster that performed well in both operations and safety, and then a low-performance cluster that performed low, at best average, in both dimensions. So you'll notice an absence here, right, where we might expect a trade-off sort of outcome. But there's only 10 workplaces, right? So can't conclude anything from that pattern. But what we can do in this type of research is look for explanations of this pattern. And it turned out variables like unionization didn't explain the difference, nor did size, nor did the type of sector they were in, but rather the culture and the management practices. So I'm going to start here first with the high-performance cluster. Its culture, or at least to the extent that culture can be discerned in a couple of days' visits, it was really about priorities. It was found that those 4 workplaces that were high performance were committed to safety. And they were disciplined in the way they carried out everything. So if they had processes, processes were followed. They weren't, shortcuts weren't taken, even when, time pressure was high. They were preventive in general, so they prevented quality defects, they prevented safety, adverse safety outcomes. And they were participatory in the way that they engaged their workforce. Turning to the management practices, it was found that they had a joint management system in the case of these 4 high-performance workplaces. So this was a set of formal processes that allowed shared planning, measurement, monitoring, and continuous improvement in operations and safety. And there were 5 dimensions to these practices. So the first was a real process focus, where processes were defined, job tasks were defined, and they also monitored to make sure that there was adherence to those processes. You'll see the rest of the criteria involve the integration of safety into operations. So there was safety in the way the production system was designed and modified. There was safety incorporated into communication about operations. So that would be what's talked about in meetings, what's included in a performance report. There was safety accountability throughout the operational workforce, both management and workers. So workers would be disciplined in the case of safety infractions, and managers and supervisors were rewarded on the basis of their safety performance of their group. And similarly, human resource management practices with management and supervisors generally rewarded safety performance in terms of the way people were hired and promoted. So that's the high performance cluster. Interestingly, the route to this joint management system set of practices came either via safety or via operations. So in the case of safety, they'd introduced an OHS management system and found that the practices would actually could be applied to operations. It might be a good idea to apply there. And in the case of where they came at it through an operational focus, they actually had no dedicated safety staff, but they were committed to safety. So among their performance measures, for example, safety was the highest metric given the most weight. So I told you about the high performance cluster already. In contrast, the low performance cluster was missing this joint management system. So the 2 functions were managed separately and not always well. And there was also a so-called day-to-day culture with the low performance group. So they were reactive instead of preventive, and it was okay there to break the rules. It was okay to take shortcuts and tweak processes. And so interestingly, what happened here is this is actually where you saw the trade-off in this low performance cluster. There's some truth to the idea of trade-off. They were trading off safety in order to get production out the door, but what they were also doing was trading off their longer-term operational performance. So this set the stage for the second study. We were interested in the joint management system set of practices and sought to generalize the finding beyond 10 cases. And specifically, our primary hypothesis was that the presence of joint management systems would have a positive impact on both safety and operational outcomes. So here we had a cross-sectional survey linked to workers' compensation data. The survey involved a pair of respondents, both an operations manager and a safety manager. Recruitment was via the operations manager. Robust regression analyses were carried out separately for 4 separate operational outcomes and 6 separate safety outcomes. Maybe I'll pause. Do you have any questions about study 1 before I go into study 2? Dorcas, and then Curtis.
The gathering of the information, did the firms know that they were a high-risk firm or a low-risk firm when they responded or did the answer? Is that all?
They did not know that, yeah. Curtis.
I'm just curious whether you got any information or sense of financial strain of the companies that maybe that would explain why there's a short-term.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that was asked about in the interviews about their business context to see if that, but that did not explain the difference between those 2 clusters. Peter?
Just, you were talking about how, I guess, the impetus to integrate the joint systems or the management systems, 3 cases it was from safety and 1 case from
Yeah.
resources. Was there some other, I guess, that's sort of how it happened?
Yes,
was there
over
an
time.
event, or was there a person who said, this is how we're going to do things, or?
That's a great question, and I wasn't there to ask it. And it's,
So you just know the
So-
mechanism, but not if there was a
Yes.
catalyst.
yes, and I. Okay, great questions. Thank you. So let's move on to the operationalization, more about the sample. So this is a sample. We started with the WSIB registered firms for 2009 and limited it to those with 100 FTEs or more, included all manufacturing sectors. But unfortunately, now the survey was carried out by Ipsos Reid. There were over 200 of these firms that were on a do not contact list. So the survey firm is not allowed to contact them. And there was more than 200 where there was incomplete contact information. And so we proceeded with the remaining 1,100 in terms of attempting to contact them. 8 attempts were made to recruit them. And in the end, we had an 18% response rate. Well, our management collaborators were quite pleased with that response rate. I know that generally we seek and achieve higher response rates, like OLIP, for example. And, well, what can I tell you? As far as this group compared with this group, the contacted firms were a little bit smaller, and their claim rate was a little bit higher than this larger group. But when we look for differences between this group and that group, there were no differences in size, sector, and prior claim rate. So we're not too concerned about this being a very special group. Okay, now in terms of operation, did I? Yeah, okay. In terms of the outcomes measured, here are the 4 operations outcomes used as dependent variables in separate analyses. Each of them were measured by a multi-item scale. And I talked about this before. So the senior operations manager answers these questions, and he's considering his organization against his or her competitors. Safety, using the WSIB claims data from 2010 to 11, using a 2-year segment. Emil and Sheila and their team constructed claim rates. Total claim rate, which was the sum of lost time, no lost time claims. In all cases, these are allowed claims. And then there were 2 subcategories of lost time claims created. musculoskeletal disorders and acute trauma. And then finally, the lost time benefit day rate. So taking lost time benefit days, dividing by FTEs. And these were standardized. We don't often do that at the Institute. These were standardized by comparing them against the mean for the subsector. One of the reasons for doing this was to conserve statistical power, since we only had 200 firms to work with. So therefore, we didn't need a lot of industry predictors. So now turning to the measurement of joint management system practices, a challenge. I told you there were 5 dimensions. We adapted existing scales from operations and safety research. And following examination of their psychometric properties after using them, we concluded we were successful in measuring 3 of the 5 dimensions and proceeded that way. Now, I told you we had the challenge of power. And so one strategy for dealing with that was to develop a measure based on a clustering of these practices instead of looking at them separately. Let's look at the items. You can see the first is concerned with defining processes, standardizing them. The second set was concerned with the monitoring of operations, if you were an operations manager, or safety, if you were the safety manager. Both managers responded to items about risk. I think they might have been thinking about different things. And then finally, both responded about management safety communications. So you can see a lot of the items were the same for the 2 managers. What would you think? Do you think they'd be in agreement?
You said the operation manager selected the safety manager, potentially.
So some were in agreement, but overall there was a high degree of disagreement. So it meant we needed to handle the responses separately. So when a cluster analysis was carried out on the operations manager responses, 2 clusters emerged. One where the manager said, yeah, all these practices are present, and another cluster where they said they were absent. The analogous thing happened with the safety manager responses. And then by combining the results of these 2 analyses, 4 categories of joint management system practices were created. So in this first one, the 2 managers were in agreement that JMS was present. In the category at the end, they were in agreement that they were absent. And then we have 2 awkward hybrid categories that I'm going to put aside for the moment, because our primary hypothesis was concerned with this contrast between the first group and the last group. Yes?
When you were looking at those 4 elements to judge whether it was present or not, those who describe it as being absent, would they describe all 4 as being absent, or one of the 4 was missing?
Well, it tended, from the cluster analysis, in most cases, they were measured separately, but they would, if they said yes to one practice, they tended to say yes to all of them. So our primary hypothesis was concerned about whether whether joint management systems had a positive impact on both operations and safety outcomes. So here is the result of the regressions with the 4 regressions using operational outcomes. And here are the regression coefficients representing the contrast between that joint management system absent group, the 4th group, compared to joint management system present. You can see there's a consistent pattern of a negative coefficient. So it's representing that operational performance was poorer when the joint management system practices were absent. And in 2 of the 4 cases, statistical significance reaches the level of less than 0.05. We also, and you can see that the models included control for variables that could have impacted either the safety or operational outcomes and interfered with interpretation of the results. So there was FTEs representing the size of the organization, percentage of temporary workers, percentage of overtime hours, and these 3 beautiful words that measure the business environment. And were found to be significant in the case of the operational regressions, but not the safety regressions. So if we turn to the safety outcomes, we also see a consistent pattern. In this case, the positive regression coefficient is indicating that claims were higher when the joint management system was absent. So safety performance was poorer in the absence of joint management systems. 2 out of 6 of the outcomes are significant at a level of 0.05. And yes, I mean,
for the group that they didn't have any joint management system, any two-way management system, what kind of safety practices were they implementing? Was it like a safety program? What did they have?
good question. So in this study, we didn't try and do a comprehensive measurement of all the practices. It would have been exhausting. Yeah. So then I think we really have to consider the 2 studies together to have a fuller picture. Certainly there's a number of limitations to the second study. But I think we can take away some messages. Despite the limitations, we think there's a contribution. We know there's been a contribution to an area that is really quite, there's a research gap. So the studies together suggest there's no evidence that the achievement of operational and safety goals necessitate a trade-off. And in fact, safety and operational success can be achieved together. And associated with that is this joint management system construct, which, to remind you, consists of integration into some operational practices and also good management of operations. So I think for health and safety practitioners, the idea of integrating safety into operations is a common message. And I think this provides some empirical evidence supporting that advice. And the data also then suggests you don't need to sacrifice your business aims in doing so. And I think for health and safety researchers, it brings our attention to this idea of good management of operations, which is something we don't measure or think about all the time. So I'd like to acknowledge the work was supported by the former WSIB RAC granting program, and we're supported by the Ministry of Labor. There's all sorts of ways to follow IWH on an ongoing basis. And as you said, there's lots of time for questions.
Thank you.